today our lecture is going to be on unpacking the Knights of Cabiria, and specifically, it's going to be on unpacking the realist stylistic form inside the Knights of Cabiria. Now, before we begin going into the scenes and an overview of the film itself, I would like to talk about a couple of different theories of realism that are going to be pertinent for our discussion. So there are three dominant theories of style that have been around for the last century or so, and they are called realism, formalism, and classicism. Now, what are these different theories of style? Okay, these are different theories that are trying to talk about what is cinema best at doing. Okay, like painting, like sculpture, architecture, all these different arts have a specific quality about them that makes them uniquely good at portraying certain aspects of reality. Okay, now cinema itself is unique in several ways. According to Andre Bazin, you can see on the second bullet point on the slide over here, he is a theorist of realism, and he argues that cinema is unique because it is a photographic medium that is not just capturing still moments in reality, but also moving moments. So he believes that cinema is the closest that you can actually get to preserving reality in as objective a fashion as possible. So he is of the camp that art should indeed imitate reality, and imitate reality so well that it is a perfectly preserved capture of reality. Now, Andre Bazin says that there are two aspects of reality that need to be preserved in order for cinema to really reach its potential, and that is ambiguity and continuity. So ambiguity is referring to how when we look at the world around us, we're not often focusing on any particular element of what we're seeing. We're just taking it all in, right? And so that is what Andre Bazin meant is ambiguous about our reality. We don't go about our life always focusing on one thing in particular, the way Hollywood cinema might, for instance. In a Hollywood film, you might move from one shot to another, one close-up to another, but our life is much more ambiguous than that. It is much less linear than that. So Andre Bazin felt that cinema should embrace that ambiguity of life. Now, continuity is a second quality of reality, he says. We don't experience reality in pieces at a time. We don't experience reality as shots or breaks in the flow of time. Instead, time should flow continuously. It should have a duration that we experience. And hence, he does not believe that editing should be used all that much in cinema, right? Because to preserve the continuous duration of time, we need to have cinema photographs keep rolling continuously without any stop. Now, Sergei Eisenstein, on the other hand, he is a proponent of formalism, right, which believes that film is unique because it is a mechanically reproduced medium, meaning that you can play with editing, you can change the content that's inside the shot in order to create a version of reality that expresses what you're thinking from the inside. Right, so he believes that reality should be shaped according to the perception of the filmmaker or the artist. It should not be simply be about preserving the ambiguity and continuity of your experienced reality. Now, Hollywood, on the other hand, is kind of a middle ground between these two. Right? Hollywood embraces the theory of classicism, which refers to how we would use styles that are formalistic to express certain emotions, right, that are pertinent to the main characters inside the film. But the style that we're using to express these emotions should never be so over the top or exaggerated that they detract from the realistic look of the shot. In other words, Hollywood filmmakers and theorists of classicism believe that film should express a psychological reality, right? The reality that we experience psychologically, which means it's neither completely driven by expressionistic form and emotion, neither is it completely driven by the desire to preserve the objectivity of reality, but instead it focuses only on things that are important to us and what we're trying to achieve at any given moment in time. Right? So the psychologically realistic style of Hollywood cinema is focused on really helping us see a goal-driven cause-effect narrative proceed. Okay, do we have any questions at this point about theories of realism and formalism and classicism? Okay. If not, let's move on to the next slide over here. So, Italian cinema, as I've been discussing in the last few classes, it is certainly a very gritty, realistic look, but it went beyond capturing just things that looked realistic, right, to expressing the theory of realism in its stylistic form. And why did it decide to adopt these concepts about film realism? Well, if you recall, we were talking about last class that Italian neorealist cinema was all about trying to show the gritty sides of reality that the white telephone films and the fascist films of the 1940s were unwilling or unable to express. Now, the filmmakers believed that in order to express these social truths in a way that was not hypocritical, even the film must be shot in a truthful way. Okay, so let's talk about how these kinds of truths are perhaps different between formalism and realism. Okay, for formalist filmmakers, they believe that the truth that is being captured through their camera is something called extrinsic truth. Why is it extrinsic? It's because the truth is extrinsic to the reality that is in front of the camera. The truth that is being expressed by formalism is the truth that emanates from inside the filmmaker or the artist themselves, extrinsic to the environment. Now, realism, however, believes that truth is not something that is expressed by the filmmaker. It is something that already exists intrinsically in reality, in the reality around the filmmaker. Hence, Italian neorealists believe that they want to use realism to capture the intrinsic truth of reality. Another way of putting this is that filmmakers and theorists of realism, like Andre Bazin, right, believed that formalism was a style that was overly manipulative. Right, they told us what to think. Right, they used soft focus, overly expressive lighting at times, jarring jump cuts. Right, which you can see in German expressionism, Soviet montage, and classical Hollywood. The theorists of realism believe that all of this would create viewers who are passive, who only absorb but do not reflect critically on the messages being shown to them. Now, the realist theorists, of course, then stated that their approach towards capturing the intrinsic truth of reality was superior to the formalists, right? Because they believed that by showing images with deep focus, meaning everything is in focus in the frame, so you can literally focus on everything that's happening inside the background, the foreground, and the midground. They would use these long duration shots called long takes with very few cuts in between, and they would de-dramatize the narration so it would feel like it was capturing the boring bits of life. They believed that by making things so ambiguous, it would be up to the viewer to determine for themselves what is meaningful inside the scene. So the theory goes that through realist style, you would create an active form of spectatorship. Right. Furthermore, another quality of realism that the theorists were trying to highlight was that unlike formalist filmmakers, a realist style acknowledges the fact that cinema is limited at gathering knowledge about the world. Right? They're trying to say that even if we have such a powerful technological medium that can preserve the reality that's in front of the camera, by no means does it mean that we have this omniscient understanding of the events going on around us. Everything is limited to what is seen in front of the camera lens. Right? Formalists, on the other hand, would say that there is no limit to the knowledge that they can express through film form, because they can shape the realities in front of the camera in whichever way they would like. So you might say that Italian neorealists adopted this theoretical framework because they wanted a more humble, if you may, way of seeking truth and knowledge about post-war Italian society. Now, all this being said, right, films are never so black and white so that you can say this is clearly a realist film or clearly a formalist film or that is definitely classical form, right? Instead, more often than not, films, whether it's in Hollywood or Italian neorealism, they blend these different styles together. Moments in which one type of style, right, sort of deviates from its dominant convention and suddenly adopts the techniques of another style, that is called stylistic excess, right? Let's say a film such as Nights of Cabiria is primarily realist, but it has many moments which are also formalist, right? Because the style is especially prominent or especially expressive. So here are a few tips, right? As you go about your analysis and your scene analysis, how do you notice these kinds of moments in which style is deviating from the dominant convention, right? So realist films, we just gave the example of Nights of Cabiria, maybe there are formalistic moments, like in the scene where Cabiria is on top of the stage, right? Trying to participate in the magic show. The lighting inside there is almost approaching that of German Expressionism. But there are also realist moments in formalist films, right? Films like M in German Expressionism also show the grittiness and the deep focus, right, of the German streets. They do so not necessarily to capture reality in its objective form, but perhaps to really perhaps emphasize just how scary and realistic looking the German streets are at the time. So there are certainly realist moments in formalist films as well. And finally, classical films, right, Hollywood films, will contain both realist and formalist moments. Oftentimes the formalist moments will pop up when the filmmaker is trying to exaggerate or really bring to the forefront a character's emotions. But you may have realist moments in when the filmmaker is only trying to clarify the overarching plot or some of the story elements of the scene. Scenes that don't necessarily have too much emotional content inside them. Okay, so let's move on now to Nights of Cabiria and how Nights of Cabiria is using a blend of classical and realist styles to express its themes. Okay, so let's talk a bit first about the themes that we find in Nights of Cabiria. Many of you guys were really doing a great job inside your scene and inside your post-screening responses of delving into the themes over here. Now, to start off, Nights of Cabiria is the final film in a trilogy of films, La Strada and Il Bidone. You're able to see the posters on the side of the screen over there. It's called the Trilogy of Grace and Salvation, basically featuring these outcasts of Italian society, right, who are exploiting others who are even poorer than they are, right, in order to survive. For instance, in Il Bidone, we see a bunch of scam artists who are playing the roles of fake priests, right, to try and get offerings from the poor. La Strada is about Giulietta Messina playing a role in which she is part of a traveling circus and carnival troupe, and their whole gig is about more or less cheating people of their perceptions. So, of course, you can gather from these kinds of plots that Nights of Cabiria is a critique of the moral corruption and dishonesty that is rampant in post-war Italy. It also tries to express the difficulty by which honest, right, and sincere people like Cabiria is, on the very inside at least, the difficulty that they have in communicating with others in an authentic manner. Now, part of this difficulty in communicating authentically with others is related to this question. Can a performance like ones you see in the theater or in the cinema, can this be something authentic? Or is life very much like theater? Everyone is putting on a show, everyone is putting on a performance for others to see, and nobody can truly see what's going on behind the scenes. This is a central theme inside Knights of Cabiria. And I believe that Fellini is saying that yes, a performance can indeed be authentic, but it is a dangerous game to play. Do you really trust that authenticity? Right? There's a lot on the line if it turns out it is actually a dishonest performance. So in all his films, especially in the trilogy of Grace and Salvation, Fellini is looking at how characters search for salvation from a sense of loneliness and emptiness in post-war Italy, and how this kind of search for salvation is really related to their desire to be uplifted on a spiritual and also on a philosophical level. Okay? Do we have any questions so far? Okay, how are these themes expressed? They're expressed through what your reading calls the open form. Okay, obviously the open form is in contradistinction to the closed form. Okay, an open form means that not everything is unified, right? That you have loose ends that are not always tied up. That not everything is closely connected through causes and effects. This doesn't mean, however, that the open form is just random and chaotic, right? It means that the plot is often focused on revealing things rather than resolving things. It's often focused more on showing you the themes that are important to the character rather than resolving the character's dilemmas. As one of you wrote, the ending was extremely cruel and did no justice for the character's future, but for some reason, Cabiria managed to smile at the end. Right? That smile at the end is a revelation that life continues in spite of all the tribulations she has gone through. That she is still resilient even though she has gone through so much tragedy. So her story is certainly not resolved, but she has a new understanding and epiphany about herself. Right? Another aspect of the open form is that sometimes events occur by accident, simply because Cabiria is standing in a particular street corner at a particular moment in time, like her bump into the final swindler, right? Oscar. That seems to happen incidentally. Every time she meets somebody, it seems to happen by incident. Open forms also have minor resolutions without a definitive resolution, right? And so as a result of this kind of ambiguity, remember we talked about how for the realists, ambiguity was a core aspect of the intrinsic truth of reality. Now, we can tease out the meanings of such an open form by drawing upon the parallels and the motifs that are present throughout each of the episodes in Cabiria's life. All right, so let's take a closer look at these parallels and motifs. Okay, take a look at the diagram on the right. Okay, and on the left, I have a very basic plot segmentation of Knights of Cabiria. Right. You can see that essentially each of the different major acts of this film are divided into men, right, and also institutions she comes into contact with. Each time, her hopes are raised that she'll finally find someone or something that she can believe in, that she can elevate herself both emotionally and spiritually. But each time, of course, you can see that she is let down, right? There's like a mini climax in each of these forms, as if each of these could be episodes in a TV miniseries. Right. So, I want you guys to write down a couple things. Take about 30 seconds or so. Jot down what you think are some of the recurring characteristics of each of these episodes, beyond the ones that I just mentioned. This will be helpful to understand what the open form is all about. As one of you guys mentioned, in the open form, the whole time I was rooting for her and just wanted her to get out, and it came full circle, right? There's a lot of symmetry in each of these episodes. I'll give you guys 30 seconds. All right, what are some of these recurring characteristics? You guys can type these out. I'll be looking at the chat box right now. Or if anybody has a microphone hooked up, they can respond to this question right now as well. Absolutely, all great examples. Kind of a every single episode, right, has a rise and a downfall. Exactly, a man is her salvation. We see that Fellini is in many ways critiquing the ultra patriarchal society of post-war Italy at this time. What did you guys notice were perhaps some recurring stylistic characteristics of each of the episodes? Winston, you make a really interesting point over there that she spends more time talking than observing the situation. Because she does indeed make that mistake, right? With Giorgio, with the pilgrimage to the shrine, right? With vaudeville as well, she's the one performing. But with Oscar, she seems to have learned her lesson. With Oscar, he's the one doing the talking, and she's listening, right? So each time she goes through these different challenges, she seems to learn a little bit of something. By the time she's with Oscar, she almost decides to not give him a chance. She's rather cynical at the very beginning when she meets Oscar, right? So there is a kind of development. It's not as if every single episode is playing out in exactly the same way. Do we see any recurring stylistic characteristics of each episode? Absolutely. Sometimes the lighting might not be soft, but sometimes the lighting might be done with backlights, for instance. Like in the shot where she is on top of the stage and she is picking roses for Oscar, right? We see that really strong backlight that produces a halo around her and she gets this angelic representation. In that scene, the lighting is not too soft, it is rather harsh, but it certainly lets her stand out from the crowd. We see that she has these elevated beliefs over the crowd. Absolutely, I love your comment, Truman. That whenever she feels that she is in the moment of her downfall, right? Like in the ending of the Oscar episode, there's this wide open space where she's on top of a cliff. There's a real sense of uncertainty, right, at the end of each of these episodes, and Italian neorealists in general are very keen on using wide, empty areas, as you mentioned, like the streets, the beaches, right? But also parts of Rome that are still under construction, parts that are still not fixed from the war. They love to use these kinds of streets as symbols of the kinds of emptiness and insecurity that the characters are going through. Yes, she is always back at her stand, according to Lily. We get a sense that that is her comfort zone, right? For instance, every time she goes on one of these episodes, she wants to leave her comfort zone. She wants to leave that life behind. But the setting, just like her cynicism, just like her place in society, continues to pull her back. And so that street corner is a symbol, right? Is a motif that really demonstrates how it's just difficult to be able to leave your social station in a society that is so um, unequal and also materialistic as post-war Italy's. Yes, high contrast lighting occurs when the betrayal occurs. So it goes into kind of a German expressionist mode, very formalistic uses of style sometimes when the betrayal occurs. Yes, her appearance, according to Kelsey, right, is always going to be changing as well. Notice, I believe one of you guys mentioned this last class, her eyebrows even change directions by the time we get to Oscar, right? Throughout much of the film, her eyebrows are pointed up, right, giving you this kind of skeptical, almost caricatured look of a person who's just, cynical about things. But by the time you get to Oscar, she finally has a more natural shape to her eyebrows as well. Okay, great observations, guys. So these are all ways of exploring how open form works inside a realist film. Now, there's some really interesting ways in which Knights of Cabiria and Fellini's movies in general depart from the narrative conventions of neorealism. Right? If you recall, early neorealism was focused on class inequality, it was focused on unemployment, it was really focused on showing these big picture, overarching critiques of Italian society. It didn't have a lot of complex character development. Right? Knights of Cabiria, on the other hand, it really shows a complex character who is torn by a desire to feel something stable in her life, which is her life as a streetwalker. Right? But it also shows you her desires for something beyond that as well. We would say that she expresses self-awareness and agency. Right? This means she is not overdetermined. She is not completely constrained by her social station. This is a significant departure from early neorealism because early neorealist filmmakers like De Sica would often argue that it is impossible for a single individual to have enough agency and self-awareness to truly be able to escape their social confines. Because Cabiria has such social agency, through her interactions with other members of society, she presents a kind of mirror, right, to all sorts of other social classes and social types. For instance, each time she meets these different characters, whether it's Giorgio, whether it's the priest, whether it's Oscar, it reveals different expectations people have about the different classes. Giorgio may be part of the working class. The priest, they might be part of a class that seems to be independent of all these different socioeconomic distinctions. Oscar seems to be from a more upper middle educated class, but she reveals that in spite of all of these different distinctions, everybody in the end is ultimately the same, right? That they desire connection, but they are still out for themselves first and foremost. And because of that, they want to reach out to her, but they also want to take advantage of her. Right? So you can ask the same thing about how Cabiria kind of puts up a mirror to society by looking at the different ways she's confined by the expectations of those around her have on Cabiria herself. Right? And again, how we see that she has agency is her ability to escape and challenge these expectations. Perhaps the most dominant expectation of all is that people expect her to be cynical. All the other prostitutes and streetwalkers believe that she is naive, right? That she should learn from her lessons, but each time she proves them wrong, that there is still something worth believing in, that not everything is just an inauthentic performance. So this is where Fellini's Catholicism comes in, right? Though he certainly coincided with the early neorealists in their Marxist views of society, that overarching social changes occur through class struggle, he never believed that individuals are going to be completely determined just by their class. Instead, he believed that they can reach for something deeper than just class affiliation, right, or revolution on a class, in a class context, because they can redeem themselves, right, seek salvation and a deeper spiritual truth. In his films, we really see a triumph of innocence over what the early neorealists believed was the brutality of everyday life. He writes, for instance, the positive nature of Cabiria is so noble and wonderful. Cabiria offers herself to the lowest bidder and hears truth in lies. Though she is a prostitute, her basic instinct is to search for happiness as best she can and as one who has not been dealt a good hand. She wants to change, but she has been typecast in life as a loser. Yet she is a loser who always goes on to look again for some happiness. Let's think about this for a moment. Okay? Does this sound like something that a true realist would actually say? Doesn't it sound a little bit more of something a classicist would say, right? Recall how Hollywood filmmakers, they are driven to really paint these interesting, complex portraits of characters. That's what we love about classical style films. They're good at telling stories about characters. If Fellini is so focused on Cabiria's character, does that make him any less of a neorealist? Does that make him more like a traditional Hollywood filmmaker? Okay, so this is what we're going to explore in the remainder of the class. And let's start getting to a potential answer to that question by looking at this following scene over here. Okay, I'm going to play the scene. This is immediately following after she pays her respects to Mother Maria, right? And they are out lounging outside the church, and Cabiria is saying that nothing seems to have changed. I want you guys to take out a sheet of paper and to take several notes, right? On one side of the paper, I want you to put down classical, right? And on the other side of the paper, I want you to put down realist. And as you watch this scene, record what elements of the scene, narrative and also stylistically, right, conform to the realist style or conform to a more classical style. Give you guys a moment to prepare the sheet of paper, and then I'll play the scene. Okay, if you're ready, type in ready in the chat box, and I will proceed with playing the clip. Okay, let's get started then. Okay, so in the interest of time, let me summarize some of the ways in which this scene follows and departs from the realist style, and you can follow along and see if you have similar kinds of notes taken down. Okay, so we can see just from the cinematography, right? We often have deep focus. Everything is in focus, as you can see from even this shot, for instance, right? It certainly does not cut too quickly when we are showing these larger shots of the society around her. Both of these kinds of stylistic choices would indicate a kind of realist style, right? Furthermore, we're never just focused on Cabiria and her little troupe, right? We keep bouncing back and forth between the people playing football in the background, between the nuns, between different parts of the group and Cabiria. So, in that sense, it continues to be realist because it's interested in portraying not just a single person's perception of what's going on in the scene, but it's looking at how every part of this environment is interacting with each other. Right? Furthermore, we have natural lighting. Right? We don't have extremely jarring jump cuts that you would have in dialectical montage. Right? But what are some of the classical elements of this scene? Right? The classical elements really come through when we see the medium shots, the close-ups on Cabiria's expressions. Again, this is to help us focus on the character's feelings at the time. So even though we see a larger world and reality around her, so much of our emotions are concentrated on her through this kind of classical style as well. Furthermore, we have these shot, reverse shot sequences. We see things oftentimes through her point of view. This shot, for instance, is not an objective shot. It is the point of view of Cabiria herself, and it symbolizes, it evokes her desire to still attain spiritual salvation, but this desire is slipping away from her as they move farther and farther away from the scene. So if you just showed this shot on its own, without showing the expression of sadness and melancholy on Cabiria's face earlier, you would assume that this is an objective shot, kind of like a documentary shot. But because of that previous shot, we know it's her point of view, and thus imbued with her emotions. And hence, this scene is a great example of how classical and realist stylistic forms can be combined together. So, scholars like to call this kind of combination of classical and realist stylistic form in Fellini's movies a carnivalesque realism. Now, where does this term, the carnival, come from? Okay, it comes from the fact that Fellini's movies are never just purely social satire, and they're never purely just slapstick comedy, but they're a combination of the two. They mix the genre of slapstick comedy, right? For instance, all those dancing scenes in which she looks like she's making a fool of herself in the nightclub, right? Mixed with these kinds of scenes that are more sincere, it mixes genres that are both serious and lighthearted to create what Mikhail Bakhtin, a Russian scholar of literature and stylistic form, he calls this the tone of the carnivalesque, okay? Meaning a tone in which we feel a sense of liberation from social norms and a subversion of dominant ideologies through humor and chaos. Right? Think of those Tom and Jerry cartoons that you watched growing up, right? Or the Looney Tunes, for instance, where everything is blown up, destroyed, and killed, right? In a very surreal, right, carnivalesque manner, right? These, according to Mikhail Bakhtin, are ways in which art expresses, right, our yearning to live beyond the confines that are set for us by the dominant ideology. And so clearly, in a film such as Nights of Cabiria, which are set in the real world, but contain almost seemingly unrealistic scenes that are portraying Messina's character, right, acting in a kind of carnivalesque manner, that is Fellini's way of critiquing the kind of staid, dominant ideologies of capitalism and materialistic excess in post-war Italian society. Many examples of this carnivalesque realism abound. The nightclub scene, right, where we see these spectacular moments of dancing. Cabiria, when she is shouting with vulgarities and obscenities at the other streetwalkers at her station, right? The worship sequence, where everybody seems to be trampling each other, and then in the scene that we just saw, where people seem to be making fun of the experience they just had. All of these are elements of the carnival saturating the depiction of reality in post-war Italy. So let's go back to the question I just mentioned a few moments ago. Is Fellini ultimately a classical filmmaker? Is he a classicist? Or is he a realist filmmaker at heart? Right? So this is an argument that is trying to say that he is a little bit of both, as we have been trying to work towards. Right? How is he a little bit of both? Let's tie this to the themes of the film and about the nature of performance. Okay? The star of Knights of Cabiria may not be the environment, it may not be the social settings, right, or any particular class type in Rome at the time, but it is really Cabiria herself, right? She steals the show. This is something that is a no-no for many other Italian neorealist filmmakers because they want the star of the show to be the environment, to be that society. These performers, they're just actors within this larger environment. Right? But we constantly see how Cabiria is trying to connect with us, the spectator, right, by conveying such expressive emotions. In the last scene, for instance, at the very last shot of the film, she even looks straight into the camera. We call that breaking the fourth wall. She literally decreases, she annuls that distance that we, the spectator, have from the reality that is represented inside the film. This is definitely something that realist filmmakers would not do. Now, this may seem like an extreme way of connecting with the spectators, right? But there are so many other scenes in which we see how Cabiria is trying to connect with an audience, right? In the magic show, as well as the church, she is trying to reach beyond reality to some greater supernatural truth that exists off the screen, right? So the audience, all the people who go to church, all the people who watch her performance in the magic show, they're participants rather than observers of her life. So Fellini is a very special kind of realist, right? He doesn't want to realistically portray humanity from an objective distance, like this cold scientist type, right? But instead he's a humanist, right? He wants to explore the reality of the character and their psychological experiences of reality by going into their world. He is an empathetic filmmaker, right? An empathetic realist filmmaker. In each of these scenes, like the theater and the church or the cinema, right, we really see that Fellini is trying to tell us that truth is not just what is visible. Truth is not just something you can capture through film, through long takes, long shots, deep focus. He argues that truth is not the same as objectivity. Instead, we need to suspend our disbelief of that which is fake, right? Whenever we go to the theater, we enjoy what's on the screen because it's a fictional drama. But for a moment, we believe it's kind of real. When people go to practice their faith and their religion, they need to suspend their disbelief of the fact of the potential that it might just be a narrative produced by the state or by the religion itself. Perhaps there is something truthful behind that as well. And it's the same with the cinema, right? And so Fellini is saying that hope and empathy, all these aspects of the humanistic experience, they're not always visually observable. They cannot always be captured through a realist, objective style, but these are part of truth itself as well. So this foregrounding of the invisibility of truth, the truth that escapes the capture of realist aesthetics, is a type of reflexive gesture, okay, on the part of Fellini as a filmmaker. A reflexivity, as you can see from the slide, is a quality of a film's narrative or style that helps us to question the very nature of the experience of cinema itself, right? He's telling us, reflexively, that cinema is not just about the capture of objective truth. Cinema is like a magic show. It helps us to believe and to hope for something that is truthful beyond what can be seen. So let's end this discussion then by looking at a couple of quotes by Fellini himself and also Bazin, the foremost theorist of realism. Fellini says, "Certain people still think that neorealism is fit to show only certain kinds of reality, and they insist that this is a social reality. But in this way, it becomes mere propaganda. It is a program to show only certain aspects of life. So here you see Fellini attacking the early neo-realists, saying that their mode of realism is too narrow, right? It believes that all the truth must be intrinsic to the environment only, but they forget that the people who live in this environment are the complex characters themselves, right? And so Andre Bazin notes this about Fellini. He says, I even tend to view Fellini as the director who goes the farthest of any to date in this neo-realist aesthetic, who goes even so far that he goes all the way through it and finds himself on the other side. And what is this other side? This other side is classical cinema, right? He tries to be so obsessive about capturing the reality that a person in post-war Italy experiences, that he no longer is concerned with showing things just objectively realistically. He wants to show the inner reality as well, and hence he adopts that kind of classical form. Okay, so do we have any questions before we discuss the extra credit assignment? Okay, my apologies for going through all this at somewhat breakneck speed. It makes it somewhat difficult as well because this is entirely electronic. But I'm going to answer all your questions once we meet again on Monday. And please forward any questions you have to me through email. And if you have time, certainly stay after. I'd be happy to answer your questions through the chat box or just through a conversation privately as well too. All right, so let's turn to the extra credit assignment. Log on to Canvas, please, which you should already be logged into at this point. Let me take a moment to log in real quick. Okay, and then click on Assignment once you are logged in. Refresh your screen if you do not see what I'm seeing. Okay, under extra credit, you should be able to see Film Festival Response extra credit. That won't be due until much later. You should be able to see extra credit Léclise analysis. Click on that. So basically, this exercise asks you to write a couple of pages on comparing and contrasting 3 scenes from a classic of Italian neorealist cinema, The Eclipse by Michelangelo Antonioni. All right, and your goal is to figure out if the scenes are realist, classical, or formalist. Right? You're going to make a table that basically jots down the different stylistic and narrative elements that fit these different styles, and then you're going to write an analysis that argues why these styles might be changing from the first to the third scene. Okay, so the detailed instructions, everything you might need to complete this assignment are in here. So if anything is unclear, please let me know. But the way this assignment is going to be graded is on a check plus, check, and check minus basis. The check plus basically means you fulfill all the assignment requirements and your analysis is detailed. A check means that you fulfill all the assignment requirements, but you only include broad observations, not very detailed analysis. And a check minus means that you miss perhaps one part of the assignment, but you still have taken notes, you still have reflected upon this in some of your writing. Okay, and this will be applied to your pop quizzes. A whole letter grade increase on your worst quiz if it's a check plus, 2/3 letter grade increase on your worst quiz if it's a check, and 1/3 for a check minus. So this is an excellent opportunity. We're not going to be grading you based on grammar. We're grading you based off of how well you are demonstrating your understanding of the classical, realist, and formalistic styles. All right, guys. Hope you guys stay safe during this weekend, and thank you for logging on. I hope this was a more or less enjoyable experience. And we'll see you guys on Monday.